Can I be denaturalized for minor mistakes in my tax return? In this video, I'm going to go over how tax issues could impact your US citizenship and under what circumstances can tax issue lead to someone's denaturalization. Please keep in mind that this is video number 4 that I've recorded on denaturalization. So if you have any questions about the denaturalization process, when the government brings these cases, what the evidentiary standards are, etc., please watch the other videos because those videos talk about denaturalization more broadly, while this video will only focus on tax issues. And as background, I used to work at the DOJ. I used to work denaturalization cases on behalf of the government. So my goal with these videos is to provide additional information and to sort of explain how these processes work, because I'm seeing a lot of mistakes in how the news are reporting these cases. And obviously people are very afraid of what could happen to them. So my goal is to kind of give real information so that those who do not have to worry can actually sleep better at night. First and foremost, welcome back to the channel. My name is Adrian Pandev. I'm an attorney who helps foreign nationals deal with the US legal system. I practice both immigration and tax law, so I'm going to do my best to explain this topic in as much detail as I can. And without further ado, let me jump right into the question of denaturalization for tax mistakes, which is what we're going to be discussing in this video. So the motivator for me to record this video is this case that has been all over the news about this lady in Houston who pled guilty to filing a false tax return in 2019. She was convicted of willful tax fraud, a crime, and was sentenced to 12 months in prison. And now the DOJ is bringing a denaturalization case against her, arguing that she illegally procured her US citizenship and materially misrepresented. So I'm going to go over this case and highlight some important things about it that are critical facts that you need to understand before you immediately jump to conclusions about your own tax return and potentially losing your US citizenship. So first and foremost, she committed tax fraud and was convicted of tax fraud while she was a permanent resident. So this happened before her becoming a US citizen. She was a permanent resident when she committed the fraud. Second, she was aware of it. So it was willful tax fraud. She pled guilty to it. So at the time when she was a permanent resident, she was aware that she was filing a false tax return. She signed the tax return. This is important. And finally, she was not only convicted of tax fraud, she was sentenced to 12 months of prison, which is important because the prison sentence raises any questions about this being a small, petty, minor thing when it comes to the immigration rules. So to be clear about all of this, this wasn't just a minor, small tax mistakes. This was willful tax fraud, or in other cases it could be tax evasion, and it was punished by a prison sentence and a criminal conviction. This is critical to understand because a very small percentage of tax returns, even those with mistakes, end up in this situation. So now let's look at the legal analysis. So the first issue is good moral character. The fraud occurred while she's a permanent resident before she applied for naturalization, which means that had she disclosed this, right? If she had said, hey, I committed fraud, there would have been a question about her good moral character, because when you apply for naturalization, you have to prove that in the 5 years preceding your naturalization, so 5 years from the time of filing the application and up to the interview and becoming a US citizen, that you had good moral character. Now, if you committed fraud, you tax fraud, so you basically defrauded the United States, there's no way anyone would hold that you had good moral character. So this fraud prevented her from showing good moral character, and that is the main argument for her illegal procurement of US citizenship, because had the officer known that there was this fraud at the time of the interview, her naturalization application would have never been approved given the severity of the offense. On top of this, on the N-400 form, which is the naturalization application form, there is a question that says, have you ever committed a crime for which you were not arrested? The question is actually a bit longer, but the bottom line is, have you ever committed a criminal offense for which you were never arrested? to which she had checked in her application based on news reports, know that she had never committed this crime. But she later pled guilty to the crime that she had committed prior to filing this form. So she lied in checking the no box to this question. So this is a material misrepresentation, because had she checked yes, her application likely would have been denied and it would have never led to her becoming a US citizen. So many are claiming, I've seen a few people online claiming that this is a new question and that this question has never been used against individuals in denaturalization cases. That is actually not true. The majority of denaturalization cases I have worked and seen actually involve this question. I think that is why the question is on the form, is to catch people in these situations, because the idea is that if you committed a crime for which you were not charged prior to becoming a US citizen, you can later still be charged for that and your US citizenship can be taken away. And the idea is not to reward criminals who committed crimes for which they were not convicted yet by allowing them to remain US citizens forever because the crime is discovered many years later. That is the idea behind this question, and its use in denaturalization cases. Now, obviously, we can debate whether or not it's reasonable for the government forever to be able to do this to a naturalized U.S. citizen. But the bottom line here is this question has been there for a very long time, and there's nothing new here when it comes to the question. But going back to the case, the bottom line is the individual couldn't have proven good moral character, number one. And then number two, the individual materially misrepresented and lied to this specific question, and in general by not disclosing this fraudulent activity. Now, I'm sure many of you are, wondering, well, what if this basically means that at any point later, the U.S. government, if I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen, can bring, charge me with a crime, and if I'm convicted of that crime, they could take my U.S. citizenship. And while that is true, I think the majority of you watching this video have not committed crimes for which you will be charged with convicted of a felony and get 12-month prison sentences. So in those cases, this has always been the case, even before this administration, that the government can not only punish you and by filing these criminal charges and seeking punishment in criminal court, that they can also go after your U.S. citizenship if you committed those crimes prior to becoming a U.S. citizen. So there's really nothing new here, except that the government officially said that this is going to become a priority. But again, I just want to highlight, because I think there are very, very important critical facts here in this case that's online, is that this case involved criminal tax fraud, a conviction, and a 12-month prison sentence, because those are the critical facts that push this to where it can lead to denaturalization. So what should be your main takeaways from this case? Well, first and foremost, if you committed a crime, especially serious crimes, right? Like in the case at hand where it's a felony conviction, 12-month prison sentence. If you committed such a crime while you were a permanent resident and you didn't disclose it on the naturalization application, well, in those cases, there is a risk of denaturalization because you committed a crime, and at some point, if that's discovered, you may be charged, and if you're convicted, the government may seek to denaturalize you on top of the criminal conviction and sentence that you may receive. And this case, just to go back to the facts of this case, is a perfect illustration of this, because there was willful tax fraud, a 12-month sentence, right? All during that 5-year statutory period. If she had disclosed, she would have never become a permanent resident if she had disclosed it, because she couldn't have proven good moral character. There's no questions that this was material misrepresentation and illegal procurement of U.S. citizenship. So if you committed a crime during those 5 years prior to becoming a U.S. citizen, it's discovered in the future, it could come back and could lead to your denaturalization if you're convicted of that crime, and that crime is serious enough where there's no question that you could have ever proven that you had good moral character to become a U.S. citizen. Important to note here is that it's irrelevant whether this is tax fraud or other crimes, right? Tax fraud is just one type of crime, but if you are discovered to have trafficked drugs at significant quantities later, the same thing could apply to you and many other crimes, right? One thing I want to mention here is that I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a few more cases like this come up in the news, because I believe that one aspect of these cases is that if these denaturalization cases are brought against individuals who have committed these crimes and did not disclose them, etc., it very much discourages lying on immigration applications. It's a deterrent for anyone who may be considering, omitting critical information or misrepresenting anything, because they're seeing people get caught who have done this. So the bottom line here is I do anticipate a few more of these cases in the future. I don't think there's going to be a tremendous amount of them, simply because it would be very hard to bring so many cases against individuals who've been convicted of felonies. There's just too many people. But I do anticipate a few. Now, very critical point 2 here, major takeaway in my opinion, is that this individual was sentenced to 12 months of prison and was convicted of tax fraud. So this isn't something minor. I'm sure many people will say, and I've already seen comments like this online, that says, everyone should be afraid of minor mistakes on their tax returns, and the government's going to go after every naturalized U.S. citizen who's made a mistake on their tax return. And I just don't see how this case proves that. Because again, if you have made a mistake with your taxes, the IRS will send you an audit letter. You can even challenge that in tax court, right? Like, those are all civil matters. What we're seeing in this case is a criminal tax fraud case brought against someone. So it's a criminal case. This isn't just the IRS making sure that you paid the right amount of taxes and reported all of your income properly. This individual was convicted of tax fraud and sentenced to prison by a criminal court. That is a very small amount of tax returns that would ever fall into this category of cases. So to summarize, takeaway number 2 is, if you've made minor mistakes in your tax returns or you late filed a tax return, I don't think this case proves at all that you can be denaturalized. Now, if you've been convicted of tax fraud, that's a different topic, and this case understandably may have you worried. But again, I anticipate that is a very small amount of you watching this video. The third takeaway from this case is that I think naturalized U.S. citizens should be very careful with both tax and immigration advisors who are going to kind of blow this case out of proportion and sensationalize the probability of someone getting denaturalized. The bottom line is that by telling everyone that, if you made a small little tax mistake, you can lose your U.S. citizenship, this will force people to go talk to tax advisors, go talk to immigration advisors, etc., and it generates fees, right, for these services. So I want everyone to be careful, and I know I'm repeating myself here, but I want to hammer it in and make sure it gets through in this video. In this case, it was criminal tax fraud, a criminal conviction, sentenced to 12 months of prison. It wasn't something minor. It wasn't an audit letter. It wasn't a late filed tax return. It wasn't a payment plan with the IRS. It was none of those things. So again, if you have serious criminal convictions or you've committed crimes for which you've not been convicted yet, before you naturalized, that's in those cases, you may have something to worry about. But the idea that minor mistakes on your tax return will lead to your denaturalization, I don't think is true, and I don't see how this case proves it. And I just want to caution everyone to be careful if anyone is scaring them into paying extra fees for whatever it is on the tax side or immigration side because of this case that has been publicized. Your fourth takeaway from all of this should be the role of the courts. And basically all these articles I'm reading, they're saying that the DOJ filed a denaturalization case against this individual for the tax fraud for which she was convicted. However, I haven't read so far, and maybe there's other articles out there, but right now, based on everything I've read, all it is that this case has been filed with the courts. But it's a judge who has to consider whether or not the government has proven to a clear and convincing standard that this individual illegally procured or materially misrepresented in their naturalization application and should have never become a U.S. citizen. Now, in the case at hand, I think the facts are bad. There's a criminal conviction. There's a 12-month sentence. it would be hard to prove good moral character under these facts for the 5-year statutory period. But for those of you worried about minor tax issues, don't forget the government would have to prove to a federal judge that had you disclosed those minor issues, they would make it clear that you didn't have good moral character and you should never be allowed to become a U.S. citizen, that the officer could not have approved your naturalization application had you disclosed those minor issues. Now, again, if this is audits, payment plans, late filings, whatever it may be, minor tax problems, I just don't see how the government can meet that burden. Here, and again, so far from what I've read, the government hasn't really met this burden yet because the judge hasn't ruled to denaturalize this person. In the case at hand, though, the facts are bad because there was a criminal case. So if you've been charged with tax fraud or tax evasion or anything like that and convicted of that, and on top of that sentenced to prison, yes, in those cases, you have more to worry about than someone who has minor tax issues. But most of you, I suspect, watching this video are worried based on the articles about, you were audited a few years ago, or you had a payment plan, or you miscalculated, your mileage deduction or certain expenses on a certain line on your Schedule C for your small business. Those things don't lead to criminal charges regarding your tax return. Those are, call them simple miscalculations that do happen, and anyone that deals with tax returns or practices tax law or is a tax advisor sees those things regularly. Again, my goal with this video is to make it clear that I just don't see how the government can meet its burden by filing denaturalization cases for minor mistakes. The issue here is that it was a crime and it involved, in this particular instance, taxes. But if you've committed crimes for which you were convicted, or you may not have been convicted for yet but have been charged, yes, you have more to worry about. But if you're just worried about minor tax issues, don't forget that the judges are acting as a backstop, and I'm curious what the judge is even going to decide in this case. However, like I said, I think the facts in this case are worse than I assume most of you who even had minor tax issues watching this video have. The final point I want to make here before ending this video is that as someone who practices tax law and immigration law, I can picture many of you immediately asking, hey, but how do I know if my particular tax issue is minor or is it major where it can lead to denaturalization? So the way I would answer that question is that if your tax issue is basically civil, and what I mean by that is it deals with the IRS, or even if you're challenging an IRS decision in tax court, it's still civil. It's not a criminal case. So think about what would be civil. Civil would be you're getting an audit letter from the IRS, you're receiving a penalty letter from the IRS that you're challenging, or you're paying the penalty, or anything of that nature where it just basically, to put it very bluntly, has to do with money. That generally is a civil case. I don't think that leads to proving bad moral character. Now, generally speaking, in the naturalization process, you do have to prove that you don't owe back taxes. So I could see some stretch arguments that the government could make in order to try to denaturalize someone. But to be honest, again, I'm not sure it gets to the clear and convincing evidentiary standards. So at least my opinion, until I read something different at this point, is that if your tax issues are civil and not criminal, I don't think that based on this case, you should be worried about denaturalization. But if your tax issues were criminal in nature, so that means, tax evasion, tax fraud, and, the case is the government brought a criminal case against you, you were being charged with a crime, right? And you were in criminal court. In those cases, that's where this could become an issue, because if you committed that crime and you were actually convicted of that crime while you were a permanent resident. So just to clarify, you committed the crime while you were a permanent resident and you naturalized after, that's where it could become an issue. My advice is that if you fall in this latter category and you're worried about this, talk to someone who understands these rules, both tax rules, immigration rules, who can advise you. But I think the very vast majority of people watching this video who are worried about this, understandably, I don't think are going to fall into the category of cases or the level of tax issues that will lead to denaturalization cases brought against them. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, leave them in the comment section below. I really appreciate all of you watching these videos. If you find the content helpful, please, subscribe to the channel, like the video. That helps me tremendously. And I will do my best to record more videos on these topics. Thank you for tuning in. Bye-bye.